The unbreakable bond. They say a dog is man's best friend, but Michael's German shepherd, Zeus, was far more than that. He was his protector, confidant, and a member of the family, a bond so strong that it would defy all odds. Michael had been a police officer for most of his life, dedicating his days to serving the community as part of the canine unit. Over the years, he had worked with several canine partners, but none were as special as Zeus. The German shepherd had been his loyal companion for years, standing side by side with him during high-pressure situations, guiding him through dangerous pursuits, and offering comfort after long, exhausting shifts. But when Michael's time with the force came to an end, Zeus was just a year old, still young, and full of energy. Michael knew he had to retire, but he couldn't bear the thought of leaving Zeus behind. The bond they shared went beyond just work. It was personal. The thought of leaving his four-legged friend behind, after everything they had been through, was unbearable. He sat down with his boss and asked if there was any way to take Zeus with him into retirement. His boss, understanding the deep connection between the two, agreed. And just like that, Zeus, the police dog, became Michael's companion for life. At first, Zeus was a gentle soul, despite his tough training. The police force had shaped him into a highly disciplined and capable dog, but when it came to his family, Zeus was nothing more than a large cuddly puppy. He loved curling up next to Michael, seeking warmth and affection. Michael's wife and children were initially apprehensive. They were worried that the dog, so accustomed to performing aggressive tasks, might pose a danger to the family. But Michael reassured them. He had personally trained Zeus, ensuring that the dog could distinguish between a threat and a friend. Slowly, Zeus was welcomed into the family, and it didn't take long before he became a beloved member of their household. Yet there was one moment that would change everything, a moment that would reveal just how deep their bond ran. It was a bright, sunny morning, just a few years after Zeus had settled into his new life with Michael's family. The two had gone on their usual morning run, enjoying the crisp air and the quiet start to their day. But as they returned to the house, something caught Michael's eye. The roof needed repairs. He had planned to fix it that day, but as he made his way to the toolshed, something strange happened. Zeus, who had always been obedient and calm, began acting out of character. The dog started barking frantically, pacing back and forth in front of Michael. He whined and tried to nudge Michael's legs, urging him to stop what he was doing. Michael, confused, tried to ignore the behavior, but Zeus wouldn't relent. He kept tugging at Michael's clothes, trying to get him to stay on the ground. At first, Michael thought the dog was just being stubborn, but as the barking grew louder and more desperate, he began to get frustrated. "Zeus, enough. I need to get this roof fixed," Michael called out, hoping his voice would calm the dog. But it didn't. In fact, it only seemed to agitate him more. Realizing that the dog wasn't going to back down, Michael called for his wife to take Zeus inside, thinking that maybe the dog just needed some rest. But even then, Zeus refused to be silenced. He struggled as Michael's wife tried to guide him into the house, fighting every step of the way. His actions were unusual, and Michael couldn't help but feel a twinge of concern. But he brushed it off and continued with his task. Just minutes later, a horrifying scream echoed through the house. Michael's wife, panic-stricken, rushed outside to find her husband lying motionless on the ground. Zeus, locked inside, had been unable to stop the catastrophe. Michael had fallen from the roof, hitting his head hard on the concrete below. The fall had left him unconscious, and despite his wife's desperate cries, he didn't respond. The family quickly called for an ambulance, and soon Michael was on his way to the hospital, his life hanging in the balance. The unseen struggle. At the hospital, doctors worked tirelessly to assess Michael's injuries. His family sat in a waiting room, hearts heavy with fear. They had no idea how serious the fall had been or what kind of future Michael faced. The doctors performed extensive scans, but the results were not promising. Michael had suffered a severe blow to his head, and although his body was relatively unharmed, the doctors worried that the head injury might have left irreversible damage. As the hours passed, Michael remained unconscious. His wife, who had been his constant companion for so many years, couldn't bear to leave his side. She held his hand, praying for a miracle, hoping that somehow he would wake up. But the days dragged on, and with each passing moment, their hopes began to fade. Michael's condition didn't improve. In fact, he slipped into a coma, and nothing seemed to pull him out. The doctors, after a thorough assessment, spoke to Michael's family. They explained that it was possible Michael might never wake up. The damage to his brain was severe, and his body was no longer responding to the medications. They advised that the family start considering the option of taking him off life support. The idea was heartbreaking, but it seemed like the only choice to end Michael's suffering. His wife, devastated by the news, didn't know what to do. Michael was everything to her. How could she let him go? The days turned into weeks, and the family became increasingly concerned about the mounting costs of keeping Michael alive. The nurses, the machines, and the medical bills began to add up. Michael's family didn't know how long they could continue this path without any signs of improvement. It was an unbearable decision, one that no family should ever have to make. The unseen struggle. As Michael's body was rushed into the emergency room, his family was left in a state of helpless anxiety. The minutes seemed to stretch into eternity as they waited for word on his condition. Michael's wife, Elizabeth, gripped her hands together, her palms slick with sweat. She had been by his side for years, through the highs and lows, and now, facing the possibility of losing him, she could barely catch her breath. The fall had been so sudden, so unexpected. One moment, everything had been normal. Michael and Zeus, his loyal companion, on their morning routine, and then, without warning, their world turned upside down. The doctors were swift in their actions, conducting a series of tests and scans to assess the extent of Michael's injuries. The news that followed was not what they had hoped for. Michael had suffered a serious head injury during the fall, one that had left him unconscious, unable to respond, and unable to even move. The doctors could not predict if he would ever wake up from this state. For days, Elizabeth and their children clung to hope, believing that with enough prayers, enough love, Michael would pull through. But as the days rolled into weeks, the doctors' reports grew more grim. The results of the scans revealed significant brain trauma, and they could no longer promise a recovery. Michael's body was strong, but his brain, his mind, was in a battle that he might not win. The machines kept him alive, but they couldn't wake him. The light in his eyes had gone out, and no one knew if it would ever return. "Mrs. Sanders," the doctor said one evening, his voice soft but firm, "I know how difficult this is, but we need to consider what's best for Michael and for your family. We can continue life support, but we've seen no signs of brain activity, no response to stimuli. It's possible that Michael will never wake up. The decision we make now will determine how long he continues to live like this." Elizabeth's heart sank as the weight of the doctor's words crashed over her. The thought of letting go, of allowing Michael to slip away from her forever, seemed impossible. He was her everything. They had been together for over 20 years. They had raised a family, built a home, and lived a life full of love and shared memories. How could she possibly let go of the man she had promised to spend forever with? She knew what the doctor was saying was true, though. The machines kept him alive, but his body was still. There was no movement, no sign that Michael was aware of what was going on around him. His breathing was steady but mechanical. There was no spark left in his once vibrant eyes. It felt as though his spirit had already moved on, and the only thing left was the husk of a man who had once been full of life. Elizabeth was torn. She didn't want to make this decision, but deep down, she knew it was inevitable. Michael wouldn't want to live like this. He wouldn't want to be a shell of the person he used to be. And yet, the thought of saying goodbye, of giving up, seemed unfathomable. As she sat by his bedside, tears streaming down her face, Elizabeth remembered the life they had shared. She remembered their late-night talks, their laughter, their quiet moments together. She thought of the time Michael had spent with his canine partner, Zeus, and how devoted they both were to each other. Even in this time of crisis, she knew Zeus was feeling the loss too. The dog had always been a part of their life, loyal and unwavering, and he was now as much a part of the family as Michael himself. Zeus had been struggling with Michael's absence. The dog had always been so attuned to Michael's emotions, and now that he was gone, the house felt empty without the comforting presence of the man and his loyal canine companion. Zeus had become quiet, withdrawn, lying at the foot of Michael's bed, unable to understand why his beloved owner was no longer awake. He had taken to pacing the house, whining softly in his sleep, clearly distressed by the absence of the one person who had always been there for him. Days passed, and as the decision loomed over the family, the reality of their situation began to weigh heavily on them. The bills from the hospital mounted, and the financial burden became just as crushing as the emotional toll. Michael's wife, already heartbroken, now had to consider the financial and physical toll keeping him alive was having on their family. The nurses' visits, the hospital fees, the constant need for care, it was a strain on everyone. And still, Michael remained in a deep, unyielding coma, his body kept alive by machines, but his soul seemingly lost. It was then that Elizabeth, in an effort to bring some semblance of comfort to herself, began speaking to him. Every day, she would sit by his side and tell him stories of their children's achievements, of the times they had spent together, of the love that surrounded him even in his silence. She would speak to him as though he could hear her, hoping that somehow, someway, he might respond. But it was Zeus who would prove to be the key to their next chapter, in a way that no one could have predicted. The silent guardian. The days stretched on in a haze of uncertainty. For Elizabeth, each morning was a fresh battle, a new wave of hope and despair that came crashing against the shores of her heart. She couldn't help but feel like a part of her had been stolen with Michael's silence, and each decision she had to make felt like a betrayal. The thought of pulling the plug and allowing him to rest peacefully was painful, but as the weeks passed, the overwhelming weight of the decision started to feel inevitable. The family had already begun discussions with doctors about transitioning Michael to hospice care, unsure of how much longer they could afford the treatments. But there was one constant in this tumult of emotions: the silent, unrelenting presence of Zeus. The German shepherd had remained at Michael's side from the moment he had returned home, refusing to leave the man's bedside. Each day, Zeus would curl up at the foot of Michael's bed, his eyes never leaving his owner's motionless form. Though he couldn't understand what had happened to Michael, the dog seemed to sense that something was terribly wrong, and in his own way, he had taken on the role of protector and guardian. Every evening, Elizabeth would sit beside Michael's bed, speaking to him softly, telling him about the kids, their lives, and the memories they had shared. She'd talk about the good old days when they were young, about the hikes they used to take with Zeus, and how much fun they had when they'd all pile into the car for family trips. It was as if she was trying to hold on to the man she loved by reminding him of their life together. But all the while, Zeus would stay close, his head resting on the floor beside the bed, his ears twitching as if listening for the faintest sound of Michael's return. Then, one morning, as Elizabeth sat by Michael's side, the phone rang with news that would forever change the course of their lives. It was the doctor, calling to check in and provide an update on Michael's condition. Elizabeth listened with a heavy heart, bracing herself for what was coming. The doctor told her that they had reached the point where they had exhausted all medical interventions. The family was advised to prepare for the worst. Michael was in a vegetative state, and there seemed to be no hope for recovery. The doctor gently suggested that it might be time to consider life support termination, as the possibility of him ever waking up was becoming increasingly unlikely. Elizabeth's mind raced, her heart breaking in her chest. She wanted to scream, to demand a miracle, to ask the doctor if they were sure. But instead, she simply nodded, feeling the tears streaming down her face. She hung up the phone slowly, her hands trembling. It was then that Zeus did something he had never done before. He stood up, walked to the side of Michael's bed, and began to bark. It wasn't the usual bark of excitement or playfulness. No, this was different. This bark was deep, guttural, and full of purpose. It was almost as if the dog was trying to communicate, to warn them. Elizabeth turned to look at Zeus, surprised by the intensity of his actions. But before she could react, Zeus did something even more unexpected. He stepped forward, placing his massive paw gently on Michael's bed and lowering his head, pressing his nose against Michael's hand. He stayed there, unmoving, staring at the man who had once been his partner in the field. The dog's eyes were filled with an unmistakable emotion, love, loyalty, and a silent plea for his owner's return. For the first time since Michael's accident, Elizabeth felt a flicker of hope in her heart, as if the dog knew something they didn't. The next day, the paramedics arrived at the house. They were there to take Michael back to the hospital for what was to be the final procedure, life support termination. But as they stepped inside, Zeus, who had been lying quietly in the corner, suddenly sprang to his feet. His ears were flat against his head, his body tense, and a growl rumbled in his throat. The paramedics hesitated, unsure of what was happening. They had heard of protective dogs before, but never one so attached to his owner. Zeus began to bark, louder now, and he bared his teeth, his body positioned between Michael's bed and the paramedics. Elizabeth, witnessing the dog's behavior, was both alarmed and amazed. She had never seen Zeus act so fiercely before, and the sight of his protective stance was unnerving. "Zeus, stop," she called out softly, her voice trembling. But the dog would not listen. His eyes were fixed on the paramedics, and every growl, every bark, sent a clear message. Not him. Not my owner. The paramedics, clearly unnerved by the intensity of Zeus's protection, took a step back. They had dealt with dogs before, but none like Zeus. The canine's protective instincts were on full display, and it was clear that the dog wasn't about to let anyone near Michael. Elizabeth stood frozen in shock. She had never imagined that Zeus, who had always been so gentle, would react this way. But the dog's actions were undeniable. He was protecting Michael, fighting with everything. He had to keep the people away. In the midst of the chaos, Michael's daughter, who had been silently watching from the doorway, stepped forward. She was a brave young woman, and her love for her father and their family was palpable. "Mom, let me try," she said softly, her voice filled with determination. Elizabeth, unsure but knowing the importance of the moment, nodded. Her daughter slowly approached Zeus, speaking softly, her voice calm and steady. "Zeus, it's okay. We just need to help Daddy, okay? Please let them help him." It was a tense moment. Zeus growled once more, his teeth flashing, but as his daughter continued to speak gently, his posture softened. Slowly, the dog backed away, though he remained in the room, his eyes never leaving Michael. The paramedics, after much hesitation, slowly moved toward Michael's bedside, the dog still standing guard, watching every move. Elizabeth's heart was in her throat. It felt like the entire world was holding its breath. What was this dog trying to tell them? Was there still hope for Michael? The miracle and the unspoken bond. The paramedics, though hesitant, continued their preparations to transport Michael, while Zeus remained firmly at his side, not leaving the room for a second. The air was thick with emotion, and Elizabeth felt as though the entire universe was holding its breath. How could she ignore the fierce loyalty in the dog's eyes? How could she disregard the protective stance of a creature who had spent years by Michael's side, saving him time and time again? Zeus was not just a dog, he was family. And in that moment, Elizabeth knew she could not go through with the doctor's recommendation. The thought of taking Michael to the hospital for life support termination was too much. But even more powerful than her own feelings was the undeniable bond between Michael and Zeus. Could this be a sign? Could the deep love between a man and his dog be the key to something more? Elizabeth whispered to herself, "Please, Michael, please come back." She gently approached Zeus, kneeling down to meet the dog at eye level. His intense gaze softened, and she stroked his head, her hand trembling. "I know you're trying to tell me something, boy," she murmured softly. "But Michael's not gone yet. We're not giving up." Zeus seemed to understand, his ears lifting slightly as he nuzzled against Elizabeth's arm, offering comfort in his own quiet way. It was as if he had communicated what was needed, that there was still a chance, a small glimmer of hope hidden deep inside the man who had always been there for him. As the days passed and the house became quieter with the paramedics' departure, Elizabeth and her family made a decision that would change everything. They decided to stop considering life support termination. Instead, they would keep Michael at home, where he belonged, and they would continue to care for him as best as they could, surrounded by the love of their family and Zeus. The change didn't happen overnight. Weeks turned into months, but as the seasons shifted, so did Michael's condition. Every day, Zeus would lay by his side, refusing to leave, watching over him with an intensity that was almost supernatural. Elizabeth, too, stayed close, speaking to Michael, loving him, believing that he could hear her words, even if he couldn't respond. And then, one fateful morning, just as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, something remarkable happened. Michael's hand twitched, a small, barely noticeable movement, but it was enough. Elizabeth gasped, her breath catching in her throat. She leaned in closer, her heart racing. "Michael," she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. "Michael, is that you?" Zeus lifted his head, his ears perking up. He let out a soft whine, as if to say, "It's time." And then, for the first time in nearly 2 years, Michael's eyes fluttered open. At first, there was confusion in his gaze. He blinked several times, trying to adjust to the light, to the faces around him. And then his eyes met Elizabeth's. Slowly, he raised a hand, a weak but undeniable gesture, reaching for her. Tears filled Elizabeth's eyes as she held his hand, unable to speak, her heart swelling with joy and relief. "Michael, you're awake," she whispered, hardly believing it. "You're really awake." Zeus, who had been sitting quietly beside the bed, now let out a joyous bark, his tail wagging wildly. Michael's eyes shifted toward the dog, and a smile, the first in what felt like an eternity, appeared on his face. He reached out with the strength he had left, gently placing his hand on Zeus's head. The dog, with his own quiet understanding, leaned into the touch, his whole body vibrating with affection. It was as though the dog had known, deep in his heart, that his owner would return, that the bond they shared was unbreakable, even in the face of the impossible. Elizabeth watched the scene before her, her heart overflowing with gratitude. She had never expected this. No one had. Michael's recovery was nothing short of miraculous, a testament to the power of love, loyalty, and the strength of the unspoken bond between a man and his dog. Over the following weeks, Michael's recovery continued. He regained strength, though it was a long road, but the most important thing was that he was alive. And more than that, he was home, surrounded by the people who loved him and the dog who had never given up on him. Zeus stayed by his side every step of the way, never leaving, always watching over him as though guarding him from the world. Elizabeth would often find herself looking at the two of them, Michael and Zeus, sharing moments of quiet connection. It was as if the dog knew that the battle had not been fought alone. It was Michael's will to live, his love for his family, and the devotion of a dog who refused to let go that had brought him back from the brink. And in those quiet moments, as the sun set and the world outside faded into stillness, Elizabeth would whisper to herself, "Never give up, never lose hope." Because love, even the love between a man and his dog, is powerful enough to defy the impossible. The journey was far from over, but Michael and Zeus, together, had already proven that anything was possible when you believe in each other. This marks the end of the story. I hope it resonates deeply and gives the message of hope, love, and the unbreakable bonds that exist in life. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.